Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Scholastic Lutherans. Today, I am joined by Clay Gopal to discuss the Maier conference that is being hosted at Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church in Winter Garden, Florida, that Clay is graciously on here to discuss. It sounds like a fascinating opportunity. So, with that in mind, Clay, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself as well as the conference?
Yeah, so I'm Clay. I'm a member at that church down there in Zion and Winter Garden. The conference was actually originally part of a project I'm doing for the church. There's a program the LCMS has called SLED, School Leadership Education Development, and essentially part of that whole process it's for people who are interested in becoming school administrators and things like that. But part of that training is doing a project for a school. And I floated this idea by my pastor and some people from the congregation back in the summertime of what this project might be. And one of the things I've heard in a number of different places throughout the church, I don't mean like just my local congregation, but like the church at large, is that there's a large need for pastors. And being that I work at a Lutheran school in Lake Mary, Florida, not terribly far from there, that's another thing I've heard is everywhere I go is we need people in the church, young men in particular, of course, to become pastors. And so the project was kind of born out of a desire to give young men who are confirmed in the church an avenue to know what their options are for going in the seminary. And specifically what I mean would be like, college options before the seminary, get to know what the seminaries actually are, know what being a pastor is like, because I think the best way we could recruit young pastors into that vocation is through our school system. I mean, I don't know if that's like a stated goal per se on like a website or anything anywhere, but I think it would be pretty self-evident that we would use our school system to track young men into going into the seminary and becoming ordained. And so initially this was going to be just something I was going to do at my school, because most of these projects are done at individual schools. But I want to do something a little bigger with that. My own congregation was very interested in making this like a larger than just one school's thing. And we decided to make this conference to really it's for any young man who's interested in becoming a pastor. It's also for pastors who are wanting to learn about the resources, information to kind of push this to their own congregations. And pretty much that's what the whole conference is going to be. It's going to be a whole event to promote the seminary to young men, either for those young men interested in joining or for pastors who want to put that out to their families and congregations.
Yeah, so that's great. At a fairly basic level here, I mean, this sounds like a fairly basic question, but it's kind of get across like what we're even doing here. I mean, what is the value of the office of the ministry in the first place? Like, what are we looking to get out of those in the clergy, and how do we form them, so to speak? Sorry, that's such a large question, but for now, let's restrict it to, well, what's the value of the pastoral office?
Yeah, so I think in the very general sense, of course, there's a lot of things a pastor does, but I think in the very general sense, what you would get, and you could to a certain extent say this about most Christian traditions, but certainly within a Lutheran context, we would say that the essential function of a pastor is to provide the word and sacrament ministry, to give the word of God through sermons and counseling and things like this. And by counsel, I mean like, elaborating on what God's word means and stuff like this. And then, of course, the gifts of the sacraments, where we're receiving baptism and the Eucharist and absolution after confession and these things, where we're receiving the gifts of God, namely through those word and sacraments. So essentially, the primary function of a pastor is to offer those two things to Christ Church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to think about it, because in a lot of our modern culture, the way pastors are looked at is oftentimes they are described as effectively celebrities. And they're seen as people who get all this glory for doing very little and are just rich. But within the Lutherans and within higher church traditions, the pastoral office is a lot more of I mean, maybe not just higher church traditions, but I guess you could say churches that are frankly just smaller, which we find among high church traditions. Is that there's more of like an element of like, I guess you could say, being sacrificial in the office. Like it is not simply, oh, I get to make money for talking about God. like you're really putting in a lot of effort. And so part of the goal of the seminaries, for example, is to be really training the men in this. Um, so with that in mind, I mean, who's going to be at this conference? Because is it going to be people that are, I guess you could say, knowledgeable about this, like your speakers, that is.
Mhm. Yeah, as far as the speakers go, we're getting an array of different types of pastors. So we've got some of the speakers who are what you might just call a typical parish pastor. We've got both representatives of the seminaries who are going to be present there. We're going to have a missionary pastor there. We're going to have representatives from Luther Classical College, and some of the people, not necessarily some of the speakers, but some of the other people that will be at some of the other kind of conjoining events are going to be, college representatives. So as far as the people you would expect to see there, it's a pretty broad array of people. It's mostly going to be parish pastors, but again, you're going to get a lot of different experiences. We've got a lot lined up for that with people like Andrew Preuss or Dr. Adam Kuntz, and then again the seminary. So some representatives from the seminaries both will be there.
And so, what would you say then? How would you say like the seminary is going to build up the pastoral office? Because in some way, as far as I understand, you're using the conference to promote the seminaries to future or prospective students.
Mm. So essentially what we're looking for is, again, there's a need in the church for young men to go to seminary. And what we're expecting the seminaries themselves to put out is letting them know, one, what the seminary is actually like. There's a point in my life where I was also considering the seminary. You don't really know what it's like unless you go and see it, or unless they come to you in the case of this event, right? And so giving them an opportunity to understand like what is the seminary, what is it academically, what is it culturally, that kind of thing. That's a big part of what we're hoping to get for them, but also probably very heavy on the minds of especially the students themselves and their families is the logistics of it. And so another important part of that conference is going to be explaining to them what actually comes into play there when it comes to things like finances, and when exactly do you go to seminary? Do you go straight out of high school, or what are the requirements and things like that? So with all that, what we're hoping to get out through having the seminaries there specifically is going to be things like, how do you get there? What is it like? What are the people like? How will this form you into the type of person who will become a pastor? That's what we're wanting to show. One, again, to prospective students who are looking at seminary, but also pastors who maybe have that seminary experience, but maybe it's been a while since they were at the seminary, or maybe they don't have all the exact resources to talk about these things to congregations. And so we're hoping basically that people come to this conference and they leave knowing what all goes into this and how this can work for them to make it happen if they're interested.
Yeah, that's really good. So you say that this is both for, I mean, people who are already in the pastoral office as well as those who are prospective students. What could they, I guess you would say, expect to get out of this conference? What are some of the things that you may maybe not just learn, but I suppose experience as well from the conference?
Well, I think one thing would be fellowship and just knowing like, hey, like maybe you're one student at a small Lutheran school who's even considering the seminary. It might feel even kind of isolationistic in a way, because I could speak at least for Florida, where it within my own school that I teach at, I could maybe point to one or two kids that would even consider going to seminary, and they might be discouraged in doing something like that because they think, well, this isn't really part of the culture of my school. I don't know if it's part of my future going forward. So I think one thing that would be advantageous to go in is seeing that there are people that want to go into the office of the Holy Ministry, and that there's a lot of support to get you there, both from people within your own age group and then older families, not families, things like that. And so one thing I hope they would get out of going to a thing like this is to know that there are people who are wanting these same things and that there's a community to be built around that. I also would like to think that this conference is going to encourage that more formational part of or route to becoming ordained. So obviously there are multiple ways to get ordained now, but I think by far the best and most advantageous is to physically go to one of the seminaries. And so another thing I hope somebody would get out of going to this is seeing that while there are other routes that the synod approves of, far and away the best one in really every respect is going to be to physically go to one of either the St. Louis or the Fort Wayne Seminary. And so I'm hoping that's another thing they would get out of it, to say, okay, my options here are many, but I know what my best options are in most respects of that term, pretty much every respect of that term.
Sure. Yeah, and I think what this opportunity would show is, and this is coming from somebody who is not, associated directly with the conference. Like I've told you this before, but it bears in mind for the viewers. Like I personally do not intend to go to the pastoral office, and I also can't even go to this conference because I'm getting married that weekend. So I have a bit of a priority there.
You can move that around.
Yeah, I can move my wedding around. It's not as important.
Yeah.
But something like I would get out of this is just a true understanding of what the life is like of a pastor and the kinds of things that you could expect in the pastoral formation process. Because I think a lot of people have the idea of seminary or the pastoral office, for example, that it's all right, you study just theology for a while, and then you write your sermons, you write Bible studies, and that's it. But I think having the opportunity to be around other people that, as you said, there will be parish pastors, there will be others that are not currently the parish, but I think everybody will be able to reinforce that some of the key characteristics that you look for in somebody are going to be social, and that a lot of the experience you're going to get, or a lot of the things you'll do in the pastoral office, are social. And so just the opportunity of having people with like legitimate pastoral experience there to give these kinds of lectures, even if they're not just, even if you ask them outside of the lectures, I think that's a really great chance that you have that a lot of people may not, honestly, as they're disconnected further and further from their time in seminary, at least in terms of their pastor. So let me pull up, if it's okay with you. I have the website for the it's the Maier conference, I should say.
Yeah, probably should have started with that.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Let me share. Let's see which. Okay. I think you can. Yeah, I see it on the screen here.
Yep,
So
I see it too.
I have to say, I seriously, this is such a good graphic. It's
I have
really
a friend in Mexico that made that for me, so that was really cool, right?
nice.
He did a great job.
He did a phenomenal job. I like the way that you put it. This forming the next generation of Lutheran pastors, where the pastoral office isn't something you merely step into. It's not just like, oh yeah, I'm here now. In a lot of ways, it's like you're being formed into it. And we'll get back to that if that's all right. Because I remember you and
I'd love to get back into that.
But I do want to show, while I have the screen up here, the days and everything. So we have May 2nd through 4th, 2025. So this year is the year I'm recording it. And as I said, my wedding is May 3rd. So I'm sorry. But you have Reverend Willie Krills, you have Reverend Dr. Adam Kuntz, and then Reverend Andrew Preuss. If you can, do you want to talk a bit about like the actual conference schedule, just so we can see what people will be doing there?
Yeah. So again, there's kind of a lot of different steps to this whole thing. A lot of it will be like your typical conference stuff, where someone's going to talk about some topic, what is the seminary? What's being a pastor like? What are some other avenues of being a pastor, like being a missionary pastor? But it's going to be more than just speaking. Like any good church gathering, it's going to have some actual like worship services too. We're going to have matins and vespers, relative to the days that we're speaking of anyway. We're going to have games that we're doing. There's a game that my pastor came back from some I don't know if it was Symposia or some other event that was up in Fort Wayne, but it's called Chicago Ball. It's basically softball. So we'll have games, we'll have, barbecues, we'll have stuff that we go out and do. And then, excuse me, we're also going to have, I don't know if panel is the right word, but basically a period where we've got a bunch of tables set up in our fellowship hall that we're going to have a number of different recognized service organizations, RSOs, that will teach them about, again, some of those resources that might be helpful to them, either as prospective future pastors or pastors looking at, putting information about the ordination route into their congregation. So we're going to have, I know we've got Concordia, Nebraska right now. We've got Luther Classical College that's going to be there. Still working on trying to get another Concordia or two to come out. Being that we're not in the Midwest, being in Florida, it's not necessarily a hop, skip, and a jump from them. So we're lucky in that we have a Concordia, Nebraska grad that happens to live in the area. So she's going to kind of volunteer for the school and be there. But getting the official Concordias there, we're trying to get some more. But we've got a Concordia, LCC, the Lutheran Schools Ministry is going to be there. and then a couple other smaller ones that are maybe only tangentially related to the conference, but basically a number of different organizations that pastors might like to communicate with, or that potential future pastors might like to communicate with. And kind of the coup de grace of the whole thing is going to be a panel that we have with a number of different pastors. I think we currently have both of the seminary representatives who are going to be part of it. Andrew Price, I believe, will be part of it. I think Pastor Willie Grills will be as well. Basically, that's just going to be a panel that talks about what being a pastor is. That's going to be kind of, it's going to start out as a discussion between them about the different avenues of the pastoral office and where that's taken them throughout their lifetimes. And we'll have a Q&A session with that too, so that everyone in attendance there can ask them like, hey, like, what are your insights about this or that part about the pastoral ministry? And so that's pretty much the conference in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
The Sunday that we're there for, the 4th, that's just gonna be more or less a normal Sunday at the church itself. But afterwards, Pastor Reed Schoaf, who's visiting from Luther Classical College, he's going to do a little class on LCC in particular, because they're obviously about to have their first year coming up. I think it's this fall, is it not?
I think so. I could be wrong.
I believe it is. And so he's going to get a little bit of an extra showcase on Sunday, but that's kind of the optional day.
Yeah. Well, that all sounds great. I mean, it looks like a lot of fun in terms of like, I look back here and I'm like, okay, barbecue and then Chicago ball. Like, I want to be there. That sounds great, man. And I see that you're a speaker as well. What I'm seeing here is a solid amount of like speakers and an opportunity to engage with, as you said. I mean, it is panel discussion. I saw a workshop, table workshops here, where this is I guess you could say it's a bit of an immersive thing insofar as you're both getting to hear speaker series and you're getting to talk with them, but it's also nice, and it's an underrated feature, that you're actually going to get through matins and vespers, and if you stick around, a liturgy or a divine service on the May 4th. So those who are interested in the pastoral office will get to see, okay, here are the various different services you'd be doing. And I know that's not like the primary goal just to learn from it, but I think it is something that, even if you may not be cognizant of it, it is something that you would learn. You get to experience more if you already haven't.
Yeah, I mean, if you end up being one of those young men who goes to the seminary, you're going to be doing not just divine services on Sunday, but they've got their daily chapels. And I don't know for sure, but I would assume they probably follow matins or vespers format at least parts of the week, I would think. And so getting to see what that would be kind of like a taste of like, okay, well, here's what a future might be, where I'm, surrounded by other guys pursuing the pastoral ministry and the people who form you to get there. And this is what a vesper service looks like. Neat stuff like that you don't necessarily get on just a typical afternoon, right?
Right. And the final thing I'll mention while I have the screen up, unless there's something else, I mean, the pricing is pretty great. $30 to $40. It says for students 30, for adults it's 40. That's, I mean, pretty great. I mean, that's fairly cheap for something like this, to be honest. So,
yeah, we figure if this is going to be the first time putting on a conference, we're going to try and make it as agreeable as possible, especially if, again, not to come down on my home state of Florida, but we're not exactly like the Mecca of world Lutheranism, right? There's not that many Lutheran churches in Florida, and a lot of the ones that are the ones that aren't super interested in the traditional route to ordination, again, with all due respect. And so in order to get people to be enticed to come, we were like, okay, well, exactly how much do we need to make this happen? And so that took a lot of graciousness from some of our speakers who are coming down to take, maybe a lower stipend than they might be used to. And it took some good planning, some really tough forecasting on the behalf of the people I'm planning this with. But we're like, hey, like, we want people to come here. And one of the best ways to do that is to make it, not a huge dent in their wallet. So that was kind of a goal.
So I'm going to stop sharing, and I want to talk more just about, I suppose we could say, the ministry, if possible. One of the things that I personally find is there are a lot of people out there who have this idea. It's like, you have to immediately know that you want to go into the pastoral ministry. Like, you have to know it from a young age, and like, I'm going. And they forget about something like a second career pastor, or they forget about, stories like Ambrose, among others. Do you have any thoughts on that, on like second career, all that kind of stuff that you could be doing?
Yeah. So I think most of the pastors that I personally know, and experiences may vary, but I think most of the pastors I personally know didn't know by the time they were in high school, at least, let's just say high school, that they wanted to be pastors. I think my congregation's pastor, if I had to guess, probably did. And when I become a Lutheran many years ago now, like 5 years ago, maybe even more than that by this point, I guess 6. But I think he knew in high school, and I think every other pastor I've ever met that I've at least talked to this about, um, they didn't initially think, at least when they were, before adulthood, that they were going to become pastors. And so I think this is something that's going to be really helpful for people who don't necessarily think they want to be pastors, at least right now. And you mentioned the story of Ambrose. So at my former congregation that I used to be at, I taught a church history class there. And one of my favorite stories to tell when I did that church history class was the story of Ambrose, where kind of famously, he was a governor in northern Italy during his time. And he wasn't like even necessarily a particularly religious guy. All that was really evident about him was that he opposed the Arians, which was the very common heresy in that part of Europe at the time. And he pretty much got bullied into the ministry, if you want to look at it kind of like in a funny way like that, where he kind of goes into hiding, and he's essentially forced to become not just a pastor, but a bishop. So he's being thrust into a very high pressure role. And now, of course, as a governor and a grown man, it's not like that would be completely unfamiliar to him, because a bishop is not unlike a governor in a certain sense. But that's a very important spiritual role that a guy who is not even ordained kind of just gets forced into. And so I think probably that's not going to be typical for either back then or today. But in the sense that God's going to find ways to use people, whether it's at a young age and they know they want to be part of the ministry, or later on in life when they might not want it at all, right? God's going to bring to the service of his church who he's going to bring to the service of his church. And so I love the idea of Ambrose as being kind of in line of what we're wanting to do with this conference here, where, again, we're not necessarily just targeting young men who just went through confirmation. We're talking like pretty much any man who's confirmed in the church who would even consider the ministry. And again, to extend it beyond that, families and pastors who want to kind of push these things towards their families as well. And so, if you're a young guy going through confirmation, or somebody who's already got a career, there's avenues here, and that would specifically mean the physical in-person seminaries. I know plenty of people who, as a second career, some guys with like kids and a family already, going to the seminary and completely changing their finances and lifestyle, and they don't regret it a bit.
Right.
And I'm hoping this conference would kind of show them where that could be a good option.
Yeah, and something to consider is that when we look at like the qualifications, I won't share my screen, but I have on my screen the various qualifications that are in 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus 1.
Mhm.
And I won't read off all of them. If anybody wants to look, just look up 1 Timothy 3 and then Titus 1, as I said. And you'll see what the qualifications are. But the qualifications are fairly, how do I say? I don't want to say like minor by any means, but what I want to say is they're not like over specific in terms of like you have to be this smart. You have to be like, it's not like, oh, you got to be 6'5". It's not like you got to be tall. It's not like that. A lot of these are things that I think a lot of like normal Christians actually just have. And of course, we affirm male only ordination. We do not affirm the ordination of women, but we have fairly basic things in terms of, above reproach, which doesn't mean you've never sinned or something like that, but you aren't an extremely controversial person. Of course, proclaiming the truth and that being, offending the minds of the world, that's something else. But I say all this because I think a lot of people should consider going to this kind of conference and consider the office of the ministry, because if you match these qualifications and you really do care about spreading the word of God and administering the sacraments, this is the right thing for you to do, whether you know it now or not.
Yeah. So I think a common thing you hear a lot of people say, and I especially get this from students who I've had these conversations with, where I think sometimes the fear for them is that, like, they're not already Bible geniuses, or that they don't think
Yeah.
they have the academic acumen. And kind of what I would always point them back to is like, Jesus doesn't necessarily choose what you might constitute as being a super genius to be his most important disciples. Like Peter
Yeah.
was a fisherman, and by all means was at least maybe right illiterate, and maybe he learns to read or something later on. But the idea being the people who have the greatest wisdom of God, the people that write the scriptures, they're fairly common people. God uses common people to do uncommon things, absolutely. And so what I try and encourage these people, these young men that are looking at the seminary to think is like, hey, like, you don't need to be the smartest kid in general, whether we're talking biblical knowledge or general knowledge. You don't need to be able to list every single king of Israel and Judah by
I cannot.
memory in order. I sure could, right?
I don't know.
You
There are a
don't
lot of pastors that probably couldn't do that. Like, I think
sure.
most, like, yeah. Go on.
Yeah,
Sorry.
certainly not most 16-year-olds, right? You don't need to already know Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Like these are things you learn. And so one of the terms I used earlier was formational, and how the seminary is formational. Again, I would say that's the one of, if not the biggest advantage of physically going to seminary, is that it is formational. Like you're not just going to learn to do something. You can learn to do something online. And kind of a common analogy that I would use, and I'm not the first to use this, is kind of the environment that we have in the Army. I'm in the Army Reserve. And so there's some training we do in the Army that gives us, the academic knowledge to do something. Here's a book, here's how far this type of ammo should be stored from, whatever. But the reason you do training, like your basic training and your more advanced training and so on, the reason you do that in person, and it has to be in person, is because they're not just trying to give you the knowledge of something. You can learn Greek, by yourself in a room on a computer. I would imagine it's more difficult to do that way, but you can. But there's more to the pastoral office, and specifically the purpose of the seminary, than just giving someone the knowledge to do something. It's forming them into a certain type of person. And so I think that's one of the really important things that we're trying to put across is we're trying to encourage this because we want to form our pastors to be certain types of men of God so that they can do that word and sacrament ministry.
Yeah, and that's a really important thing to consider, because I mean, there's a lot you said there that I could say, but the first thing I would add is that you rightly said there are a lot of 16-year-olds, young people like, I'm not an expert on scripture yet. I don't know. Well, part of seminary is going to be teaching you that stuff, right? Like there's an element of, you have to have the dedication. You should know some stuff. Like, I mean, you should be confirmed and you should know your way around what you've been taught in at confirmation. But I think comparing what I knew at the age of 16 to what I knew at the age of 22, like once I passed, undergrad, it was night and day. And then further, what I've learned from the age of 22 to now 25, also massive. And so there is a real opportunity where the seminary understands you're not walking in knowing Greek, Latin, Hebrew. I know people that walked into the seminary where they were trained. They were like in business before. I know a guy who majored in accounting before. He didn't know Greek, Latin, or Hebrew, as you said, as the important languages. I don't know if they do German there because, reading some Luther, but a lot of that's already transferred.
I think they do like
Really?
It's like a side thing or something like that.
Makes sense.
I visited for like part of 1 week, so
Yeah.
I can remember some of these things.
But the point is that a lot of God can use you and God can transform you. And a lot of this comes down to prayer and just the effort that you have that is given by God's grace. God aids you in this. And as a layman, I can say I have seen people go into the pastoral office or just simply go into seminary and be transformed in terms of their knowledge and even their character. Where they weren't, bad characters before, but I've seen them become even stronger in terms of virtues.
Yeah. Knowledge and character, I think, kind of sums it up.
Yeah. Let me ask one more question that you and I have mentioned this before, but from what I recall, one of the other things that this conference is going to talk about, or at the very least something you can talk about, is that a lot of people in the LCMS, a lot of those in the ministry do not know of some of the resources that are available for the pastoral office. At this conference, at the Maier conference, is there going to be anything for those in the ministry already and those who are going into ministry in terms of, hey, here's the support network you have, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm assuming what you mostly mean is in regards to the seminary and that potential route, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the big things we'll be doing that Saturday is going to be talking about the logistics of making these kinds of things happen. So, of course, before you go to seminary, you get your undergrad. And so we're naturally going to promote either the Concordias or Luther Classical College as being the preferable routes to getting to seminary, because if you have that pre-seminary track, that will be very much to your advantage once you get to the seminary, both academically and just terms of the overall stress you're going to have later on, right? And so that's one of the things we're going to want to really dial in on, is not just getting to the seminary, but like how you're going to get there, right? So it's one thing to be considering the seminary, but there are other obstacles you have to clear first. And so that's something we'd like to get to the pastors and the people otherwise who are going to this conference, is to say, what is going to be a good way for you to get to Fort Wayne or St. Louis? Like, how are you going to financially do this? How are you going to academically do this? Like what are the resources you need right now? That's going to be a big part of what we talk about, especially on that second day, the main day.
Right. Is there anything else you want to discuss or explain about the conference for us? I don't have anything else at the top of my head.
Yeah, I guess if I would say anything more, I would just kind of reiterate that the pastoral office in general is a word and sacrament thing, but I think one thing that I would kind of dial in on, especially coming from a background as a former non-denominational, is just kind of what the character of a pastor is. So we didn't read specific scripture because it's easy to find those lists. We don't necessarily need to read anything verbatim, but the type of characteristics we look for in a Lutheran pastor specifically, very much in line with the scripture there. And I would contrast that with what my experience was, at least in parts of the non-denominational world, when I was coming from that background. So I had, in my own personal experience, good relations with the churches I grew up in. The pastors were good, and in their own non-denominational way had something that you might compare to a word and sacrament ministry. But I think what makes the Lutheran church so distinct is that the pastor's role in the life of a congregation is not simply like a guru who, gives a TED talk or something like that. And so, for instance, when I was living in Clearwater with an old hockey teammate of mine, there was a church this was a non-denominational church that had a main campus and then like satellite campuses. And at those satellite campuses, they would put on, like a video projector or something like that, the video of the pastor on the main campus talking. And there's kind of that celebrity status that you might get. And I shudder to think about any Lutheran church ever doing that, because there's so much more to the formation of a pastor than just having a charismatic personality that people will want to virtually interact with and really never actually interact with. I think an important part of my spiritual formation as a lay person has been that it's usually pretty easy for me to access my pastor if I have a question or like some kind of concern. The pastor he's attached to the school I teach at, I would say he's one of my closest friends, right? The pastor of my congregation is great. Every pastor I've ever kind of worked with or, been under the, is tutelage the right word? I don't know.
Yeah.
Every pastor that I've ever been around or under, in whatever way you might want to consider, they're accessible. They understand God's word rightly, and they give the full counsel of God in a way that I was not accustomed to before having become a Lutheran. And so I think part of what we want to get out with this conference is that's the kind of person the seminary is going to make you become, is somebody who's not just a guy on a screen who's never going to be able to access, or who's never going to be accessed by the people who in a almost weirdly culty way follow him, right? Like you're going to be someone who has a genuine actual role in someone's life, like you physically, right? And so that's one thing I'd kind of say to kind of put a pin on all this, is that the formation is a huge part of this. We want to shape you into people who are going to be a genuine blessing from God to whatever congregation you would potentially go to as a future pastor, because that's a big deal. It's been a big deal for me as a layperson, is the spiritual formation I've gotten from the pastors who were themselves spiritually formed at the seminary. And that's the big takeaway I would give with this.
Yeah, that's a really, really important thing to add there because, and it's not, it's not always the case that
Yeah,
non-denominational churches are that way,
sure.
but like some are smaller and all that. But I have personally found in my experience, and I say this, I'm making all these caveats because I don't want comments being like, oh, you have no
Yeah,
clue what
yeah,
you're talking about.
yeah,
But I've had, from my personal experience, like the churches that I went to growing up, pastors didn't really know me at all. I never interacted with them. And I remember I was talking with somebody who goes to like a very large church um, out here that it's a non-denominational one, that they were surprised when their pastor was able to meet with them to discuss like stuff about marriage, not like marital counseling, but just like, oh, I want to get married and here's some
Mhm.
steps I think I need to take for my uh, girlfriend and I to go through it and all that. He's like, wow, dude, I got to meet with him and all. I'm like, I can just like talk with my pastor
Yeah,
anytime. And
yeah.
like I should say, I'm open about this. People know where I attend church. I attend a University Lutheran Chapel in Minneapolis, and Pastor Kind is like decently well known across the LCMS because he's written
Mhm.
several books. Like he has some level of influence, but like if I wasn't told that before and I didn't see his online engagement, you wouldn't think that. Like it always seems like he has time for us, and he recognized that so much of his job is to be working with his congregation.
Right.
And so I think it's a real blessing of the Lutheran office of the ministry, which we do find in other denominations,
For sure.
that you have the obligation as a pastor and also the opportunity, I should say more than obligation, to really be the guide to your congregants, both corporately and individually.
Yeah.
So with all that in mind, any final comments?
I think that last thing I said was pretty much
Yeah.
how that's the cherry on top that I would put there, is that character and formation that I think is so valuable. So I think that's pretty much how I would cap it.
Yeah, perfect. Just I will put the link to this conference in the description. The website has all the details, but for those who forgot, I'll just read out the details once again. This is from May 2nd of this year, 2025, to May 4th of this year, 2025. This is at Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church on 16173 Marsh Road, Winter Garden, Florida. So I unfortunately can't make it, as I have said. But anybody that can make it, even if you like don't know if you want to go into the ministry, even if you don't think about it right now, it sounds like a phenomenal opportunity. So really should consider it. Well, thanks for joining us, Clay. It was a really a pleasure speaking with you. I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this conference. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, we'll see you guys. Bye.
Hey everyone. Thanks for watching another Scholastic Lutherans video. If you'd like to support us, you can follow us on Twitter at Gerhard's Ghost, or contribute on Patreon at Scholastic Lutherans. There you'll get access to our Telegram chat and other perks. Links can be found in the description. Subscribe, like, or leave a comment, and have a nice day.